Part 5, Idiosyncrasies and Handguns. I was going to include, in the first draft of Frank, a fuller explanation of why I left, though it hardly seems necessary. He was unstable, probably psychotic, and seemed to be contemplating killing me. But there was more to that last part which I removed because it read like a draft of fiction, something that didn't quite ring true, even though it was. That's often the way with idiosyncrasies. With Frank, there were idiosyncrasies from the beginning, as there were Magdans, which makes sense, with idiosyncrasies and Magdans both feeling like cousins of déjà vu. The Handguns came the summer we re-met, when everything was fresh and new, before his mother came to stay and soured things. We had gone to a particularly good estate sale in Joliet, in a tall mid-century house. On the way back, we stopped at a restaurant where my family used to eat after miniature golfing when I was a kid. Afterward, we passed the golf course itself, a haunted house-themed course that still had its old sign, a mint green Dracula suited with white gloves. I expressed how pleased I was to see it unchanged as we drove, both of us looking toward the course. We noticed a boy, maybe 10 years old, whose head just cleared the fence. He rested his golf club over the top of the fence and tracked our car with it as we passed, as though it were a sniper rifle. "That was weird," Frank said. "What's he doing?" I asked, pretending to shoot us. A few miles later, we passed my grandmother's trailer park, not for nostalgia's sake, but because it sits along the road back to the highway. I almost asked him to stop. My grandmother had died a couple of months earlier, and I'd heard someone bought her trailer. I wanted to see whether it somehow looked different. And I wanted to see if her hamster graveyard was still there. Over the years, my grandmother had owned several hamsters. If they were girls, she named them Toonie, and if they were boys, Daniel. In her yard stood a small hill crowned with handmade wooden crosses, each bearing the name Toonie or Daniel. I told Frank about the graveyard as we drove, and he seemed interested. "Should we turn around?" he asked. "No," I said after a moment. The same named hamsters in the graveyard was a story told fondly by my family about my grandmother's eccentricities. She'd even learned the work schedules of the greeters at her local Walmart so she could shop only when those who didn't mind her rolling in on her scooter with Toonie or Daniel riding uncaged on her chest were working. But the graveyard wasn't cute to me anymore after my aunt died and her ashes were stuffed in between hamsters, under two pieces of unfinished wood, painted white and held together with a nail in the center, Brenda scripted in Bic pen. To my mother, this somehow made the story even better. It was just another joke about quirky grandma, but I didn't care for it. Sensing my discomfort, my mother assured me that only half of my aunt's ashes had been buried with the hamsters and that the rest lay in a proper plot. But when she couldn't tell me where, I had doubts. Explaining all this to Frank as we drove, I declared, "I want to be buried with you and your mom and dad." He was pleased and grinned. There was a finality to my statement. I could almost feel the shovel patting the freshly filled mound. I remember staring out the window, content, like I'd found my home with him and his family and an escape from my own, who'd buried their flesh and blood 3 inches deep alongside hamster bones. I look back at this announcement with terror. Who says something like that to someone they've only been dating for a couple of months? Who says something like that at all? The next day, we were in the parking lot of a taco shop walking toward the entrance, and a man leaving pointed his finger at us like a handgun and made a popping motion. "I wonder what that means," Frank said. Nothing more was said about it, but I, like Frank, am always searching for meaning and felt unsettled. Pause. It was August when his mom came to stay because she couldn't stand the Florida heat. Actually, she'd also been staying with him when I re-met him. He'd sent her and her odd husband to an aunt's house the first day I came over, and she had popped back at his place early in the morning, prompting us to come out for breakfast. I was too hungover, but Frank went. This didn't seem odd to me at the time. I was just thankful that he let me go back to sleep in his bed, and I figured it must be a special occasion, his mom being in town, and he must have been hungry. I see that day a little different now, his mom walking in and out of his office continuously as Frank and I sat talking after they'd returned, and adding to our conversation from the hallway. This woman was always inserting herself into Frank's life. In fact, she lived with him half the time, which Frank venomously denied when pointed out. "Well," I'd said to him once, "she comes every couple of months, and she tends to stay for a couple months. That's half the time." "She doesn't live with me," he'd said with the indignation of a child insisting he wasn't a baby. And his mom was so needy. She didn't drive, yet constantly needed to be somewhere. She would invent situations to act out an urgency, and Frank would believe in the urgency and follow suit. Like when she needed to buy her ex-husband, Frank's dad, a new mattress, and Frank needed to chauffeur her to several different mattress stores where she got into fights with clerks about policy. The next day, she insisted they start fresh, at an even different mattress store. Her voice was shrill when she talked about the mattresses. It was very important that her ex-husband she divorced over 20 years ago get the right mattress, and it was important that the mattress store accept that her ex-husband was indecisive and may need to lay on it a while before knowing if it were the right one. From his dad's mouth, I found out that he didn't care about the mattress. "What's wrong with the one I got?" he'd said, but still the frantic hunt continued. And the day the mattress was to be delivered, it was very important that both her and Frank be at the house for the entire 6-hour delivery window, just in case his dad wouldn't answer the door. I was often left behind at Frank's house for these excursions, along with her husband Bart, a large, quiet man with acid reflux. He was addicted to World of Warcraft, a computer game that had long since faded from popular culture, save for among the Barts of the world. But while his mother's antics exasperated me, the Magdens kept rolling in. One evening, we walked through the gardens of the nearby college campus. It was a religious school, and a giant stone Mary looked down on us as we passed beneath her. On the drive home, stopped at a red light, Frank unbuckled his seatbelt and leaned across the console to wrap me in a soft embrace. I was immediately carried back to our first summer together 16 years earlier. He had been driving me home, and, while stopped at a red light in Manteno, he'd unbuckled to lean over and kiss me. I didn't ask if he'd remembered this. I felt a verbal acknowledgement would shatter some thin veil between the conscious and unconscious. We even had a couple of Magdens with his mom. One came on an uncomfortably hot afternoon with the three of us sat in his convertible gripping the wide brim of our hats to keep them from blowing away. Frank had bought several vintage hats at a yard sale and favored one with a taxidermed snake wrapped around its crown. Pause. This next insert isn't really an idiosyncrasy. It's more of a foreshadowing, but of something that never actually happened. Rather, it foreshadows something I believe could have happened, or perhaps would have, had I stayed in the relationship longer. I feel this is especially true given the role messages from the television began to play after Frank's father died. It also brings to mind a paper I wrote in art school for an abnormal psychology class. The assignment was on psychosis, and I questioned whether people experiencing psychosis might, in some cases, be in contact with something larger than themselves, something supernatural, or perhaps some kind of cosmic intelligence. We generally assume that someone hearing voices or receiving messages from the television is hallucinating. 19-year-old me wasn't entirely convinced. The truth is, I had been hearing voices myself around that age, or had only recently stopped. It lasted for a little over a year, and looking back, I suspect it was my body's unusually strong reaction to marijuana. Whatever the cause, my paper prompted my abnormal psychology professor to ask me to stand and read it aloud to the class. When I finished, she told everyone that this was the sort of thing she wished she saw more often, original thinking in student papers. That woman must have been batshit crazy herself. Pause. My dad met me at a movie theater down the street from Frank's place to see Flowers of the Killer Moon. It was a long movie, and I remember it starting with a scene of a train winding a corner along with a music score that made me emotional. The film centered on the 1920s Osage murders, a conspiracy in which white men married wealthy Osage women and then killed them to inherit their oil wealth. Ernest Burkhart was the most disturbing part. He appeared to love his wife, Molly, yet his loyalty to his uncle ran so deep that he participated in her murder. It's a true story, which is upsetting enough, but something was happening within me as I watched. It felt personal. I was seeing Ernest and Molly as Frank and I. But why? Yes, I felt abandoned when his mom came to town, and sometimes I felt second to his father as well. Frank had, in fact, been with his mother at that moment, which I felt some bitterness toward as I spent so much time with his family and he'd barely met mine. But still, that doesn't give murder energy. There had been a hint given once by his mother, but I'd immediately buried her words. I had told his mom how I'd met Frank when we were 20 and when he'd lived with his dad. she had replied, defensively, as if it needed to be explained why he was living with his dad and not her. That her younger son had insisted she kick Frank out of the house because he was a psycho, and that she had obliged only because her younger son was in his last year of school, and she was afraid he'd leave if she didn't. My thoughts moved fast when she said this, from why would someone call Frank a psycho, to why is she telling me this, to throwing out the information because it didn't make sense. But obviously, somewhere, it was stored. A huge part of me wants to say I was shocked at Frank's behavior the day his dad died, that I did not see that coming, but why then, while watching this movie, did I understand in what felt like a deep and personal way that absolutely someone could love someone and still murder them? And why, on exiting the theater, when my dad said, "I don't know how she didn't see it sooner. You could see clearly he was a slimeball. Did I feel defensive?" These questions I cannot answer. Pause. Hearing voices and getting messages from the television are probably the two things most people associate with psychosis. What I wasn't familiar with was the idea that two people could sort of share a psychosis, which is what it began to feel like was happening. The night Frank and I visited his father in the ICU. After the doctor had gone and his father had drifted off to sleep, Frank and I sat in the visitor chairs between his father's bed and the window overlooking the Chicago skyline. I heard a whisper of a woman's soft voice coming from near his father's face, as though someone were leaning over him. "Did you just hear someone whisper 'awesome'?" I asked. "She said Justin," he answered flatly. Justin was his middle name, and the name he'd gone by in his youth. He didn't glance over at me but continued to stare on at his sleeping father. I wondered whether he knew who the voice belonged to but kept quiet. The going-ons of otherworldly whispering in an ICU room is a highly suggestive omen that didn't need picking apart. 2 days later, the day of the death, our shared psychosis, or whatever it was, continued. It was dark out by this point. I had asked if he wanted a cup of water and felt a foolish sense of relief when he nodded yes, as if a glass of water could be helpful, and I, as the getter of the glass of water, had found something of value to contribute. Dum, 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 was the sound my little feet made paddling down the steps to collect water in a cup. In my defense, my whole state of being was in whiplash by this point. I am not sure if this was before or after he had screamed at me to get the fuck out of his house or he'd call the police as I sat on his bed, legs tucked under me, unable to respond. But I can pinpoint that it was hours after he accused me of being terrible to his father. I had dramatically collected my toothbrush and scattered clothes, ready to bolt, when he called me into his office, demanded I apologize, then told me he didn't want to be alone before wrapping his arms around me, softly at first, then tight, like a snake squeezing my life out. Then light again, then a tight squeeze. When I returned with the water, he was sitting on the edge of his bed, leaning towards the television. I set the glass down on his dresser. It sat next to him. A news report was on. An airplane had crashed in the Indian Ocean 10 years ago and was never found. The anchors, all serious-faced and holding stacks of papers, delivered the story as though it had happened that morning. I kept waiting for them to say it had been found or add to the story in some way. But they didn't. It felt off. "Why are they reporting 10-year-old news?" I asked. "Because my dad's stroke was 10 years ago, 10 years. And all for nothing, just so they could turn around and murder him. He sounded straight up schizo, but still, what I was seeing on the TV didn't make sense. His comment made no sense, and the newscast made no sense. I got that weird feeling where you can feel all the tiny hairs on your arms. I've since looked up this plane crash. It was Malaysia Airlines Flight 370 from Kuala Lumpur to Beijing. It had stopped communicating with air traffic control, turned away from its planned route, and is believed to have flown for several more hours before crashing on March 8, 2014. AI has informed me that it was on the news in 2024 because it's not abnormal for major stories to resurface on their anniversary. And, 2 days prior, the Malaysian government announced it was willing to consider a new search proposal. Knowing this, the memory still feels eerie, and like several things were true at once. The news story really was on TV. There was a reason it was being aired. Frank is probably schizophrenic, and something wasn't right. Pause. The strangest part came later, after I ran from his house, after 2 months of no contact on the day we reunited. He had taken a train to my apartment an hour south from him and spent the night. The next day, the train was stalled and he was nervous he'd miss his doctor's appointment, so I volunteered a ride. Pulling up to his doctor's and parking, we lingered over our goodbyes, and then he asked if I would come inside and wait with him. He was halfway out of the car and gazing down when a look of shock flashed real quick on his face before he composed himself. We were a bit early, and so we sat in the waiting room, holding hands, acting, and somehow feeling like a normal couple, as though I hadn't spent the past 2 months jolting awake in a cold sweat, as though I hadn't slept with a baseball bat on either side of my bed, afraid he would break in during the night and do something terrible. On the TV in the high corner of the room, one of those murder shows was playing. The killer had gotten caught almost immediately because it was so obvious. Him and the victim had dated on and off. She'd gotten a restraining order on him in the past. And then she came into some money, they married quickly in the courthouse, and weeks later she was dead. When saying how much he'd inherited from her, I commented, "Wow, that's not even that much to be killing someone over." "I don't know," Frank contemplated. "To some people, that's a lot of money. I mean, to most, really, that's a decent chunk of cash." A nurse popped her head out and called his name. He squeezed my hand and released. She smiled at us, and we smiled at her, and Frank, before disappearing behind the door, turned back and grinned. We were all smiling. After sitting there for 20 minutes or so, I found myself thinking about the strange look that had flashed across Frank's face as he'd gotten out of my car. He had seen something. I couldn't imagine what in my car would have caused alarm, so I decided to go outside and look. When I opened the passenger door, there, sticking out of the door pocket, was a letter I'd opened weeks earlier about my savings account that stated, I shit you not, the exact amount Frank had just argued was enough to kill someone over. Pause. Part 6. Pause. There was one more idiosyncrasy, be it small, that happened that month because, yes, I did spend an entire month practically living at his house after the doctor's office bank statement incident. After a day of yard sailing, we wandered into a small cafe called Brian's and were told as we entered that Brian was not there that day. The people who came in behind us, when informed of Brian's absence, turned around and left. "Is Brian like the cafe mascot?" I said to Frank. It wasn't until the waiter came back to take our order that we figured out the significance. "Sorry, we can't do sandwiches and stuff. Brian's not here. We can only do fried foods." We ordered something fried, and our distressed waiter toddled back to the kitchen. "Maybe that's what he should have said when we walked in instead of just, 'Brian's not here,'" Frank commented. But we weren't upset. We were in good moods. It took so long for them to fry foods without Brian that we watched a full episode of Andy Griffith that was on the TV above our table. Aunt Bee had made some gross-tasting pickles, but Andy, not wanting her to feel bad, told everyone to pretend they were good pickles. And then, because she thought everyone liked them, she had decided to enter her pickles in a pickle competition at the fair. By the ending credits, the place had filled up, probably because it was a town-wide yard sale day, and so people were out and about. Everyone's food came out all at once. Our waiter and 2 women, who must have been the cooks, paraded into the dining area with a tray in every hand. When they went back to the kitchen, you could hear high-fiving and celebrating. "And Brian didn't think they could do it," I'd said. A week or so later, we had driven down to Kentucky to visit Mammoth Cave. We were in our hotel room, flipped on the TV, and the Andy Griffith show was on. Okay, so big deal. Both the hotel and that diner probably barely had any channels, and this is a show clearly that comes on one of the free channels. But this episode was about a cave collapsing on Andy and his date. There are 249 episodes of the Andy Griffith Show. So, I don't know. I'm not saying the TV is sending me messages about pickles and caves, but for some reason, when I was with this person, and this person only, there were patterns and repetition in everything we did. Even the day we got together seemed patterned with the day the relationship ended, or at least the day I consider it to have ended, the day Frank's father died. My grandmother died the night I re-met Frank. The whole relationship was shrouded in death. Like my grandmother's death was the moon rising, and Frank's father's was the moon being lowered into the dirt. Pause. A couple months before my grandmother's death, my mom and I stopped by her trailer. When we opened the door, she was sitting there, naked, in her recliner. She was disabled, and with my grandpa having passed recently, she had no clean clothes. She had nothing really. Her hamster was dead. She had a pot boiling on the burner to keep her apartment warm, but her apartment was not warm. My mom gave her a sponge bath in her chair, and I did a load of laundry. "Come here," she beckoned. "I can't see much anymore. Bring your face up close to me." Awkwardly, I craned my neck so my face was within her orbit. "You still look good," she said with a hint of malice. "Good for you." She wanted me to fetch something from her bedroom. Standing in the doorway, with one foot in the bedroom and the other in the narrow hall, I called back, "Where's the light switch?" "She can't find a light switch," my grandmother said. Not to me, but to my mother. I leaned back into the hallway and found them both grinning at me. I may have had something they wanted, a speckle of youth left, but I was dumb and they were clever. I poked my head back into the bedroom, found the awkwardly low switch, and flipped it on. "I'm ready to leave this world," she'd said during that visit. "They're having sex with children." My grandmother knew her time was coming, and there was one last revelation she needed to share with me. "Your great-grandmother was a whore. She had to pay men to sleep with her." But Grandma, I thought to myself, that would make the men whores. I've wondered if maybe the generational trauma on my mother's side is what made Frank feel familiar to me. It's like the part of me that's my father's daughter can't comprehend how fucked up people can be, while the part that's my grandmother's daughter understands just fine.